Welcome, everybody. I am so excited to be doing this, our annual webinar. I was going to mash together Gap webinar, but luckily I caught myself. Gap webinar with my friends Jane and Jason. For those of you who are watching this on my YouTube channel, these folks are nice enough to do this webinar for us every year. So if you want to join us live, find my Facebook page, and next fall we'll do this again. But you can always reach out to Jane and Jason. They'll be providing their contact information. For those of us who are watching us on Facebook Live, we're going to go through the webinar and then we will take questions at the end. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jane and Jason.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I figured since there could be some people that are coming through our channel, maybe you could kick us off with a bit more of your own amazing work and how you got to be here, and then I'll go.
Okay, well, thank you. So I'm Elizabeth Hamblin. I'm the founder of LD Advisory. I have been working in college disability services offices for 25 years and for a long time now, trying to educate folks about changes at the college level in the applicable laws and what they mean for students' responsibilities and for accommodations. And so part of the reason that we are connected is when I wrote my first book and all the subsequent ones. I've interviewed Jason and then both Jane and Jason about gap year experiences because it is a big shift as students move from high school to college, whether they have a disability or not. And for some students with and without disabilities, another year to kind of let those executive functions develop, let the brain mature a little bit can be a good idea. But these two folks are wonderful enough to provide this learning opportunity to specifically talk to students with disabilities and their parents about what they should know, what they should be looking for. And I'm just so grateful to them. So with that, I'm going to mute and let you guys get on with it.
Great. Thank you.
We are Jason and Jane Soroyan, and we are accredited gap year consultants, which is just a fancy way of saying that our work is very similar to that of an independent educational consultant who might advise around college. Instead of advising around college, Jane and I advise around students who want to take gap time or gap years. We are now celebrating, I think, 30 years in this field for you, 25 for me. We have spent our time in a variety of different roles and responsibilities. Both of us cut our teeth as young 20-year-olds way back when we didn't know each other, as instructors and facilitators of these kinds of experiences for others. We met as directors of a gap year organization where we were managing a really wonderful organization that brought over 300 students a year to developing communities all over the world to do service learning. And now for the last 15 years have served in this role as gap year consultants. We also are lucky enough to speak all year round on the gap year, but particularly at the USA Gap Year Fairs. And both of us have been very highly involved in the Gap Year Association, which is the accrediting body essentially deemed by the Department of Justice to create standards and assess programs and consultants by who are looking to take gap time.
Yeah. And over the 3 decades we've been in the work, we have worked with thousands of students. I just want to make sure okay. I flipped the order of what I thought was coming next, but that's okay. We've worked with thousands of students and all different kinds of students, all different kinds of learners, all different kinds of budgets, all different kinds of goals and destinations. And so to start with the definition of a gap year, I think becomes so pivotal because many families come with a certain understanding, often a misconception about what a gap year is or isn't. A gap year is only for kids who don't know what else they're doing. A gap year is only for someone who has a college acceptance, or I have a kid with a learning disability. I'm not sure if gap year programs are able to support them. So just to pause in the process, and I was really fortunate to be part of the strategic process with the Gap Year Association, which Jason just mentioned, about 2 years ago, as we were really kind of refining the mission and vision of the organization. and really also to come up with a really clear and shared definition of what a gap year is, which interestingly was almost identical to the one that Jason and I have been using. But now we have established a definition that really I think is so effective for all the families considering gap time and for all of us who are in the programmatic and support side of it. And quite simply, a gap year is this intentional period of time. And as you can see here, this word intentional is really meant to be, if there's only one word on this slide, that would be the one. Devoted to personal growth and exploration through experiential learning opportunities. So we're talking about someone, a young adult, standing at some crossroads, facing an uncertain future, academic burnout, maybe some anxiety, depression, maybe concerned or confused about their college prospects, not sure. Whatever it is, that shared moment is that we're standing at a place where we have this little question, or maybe a really big question, that maybe there's another way. Maybe there's something else that can help me get to that level of independence, confidence, personal growth that I'm hoping for. And maybe the next step out of high school doesn't mean it has to be another four walls of a classroom. And as all of us know, all kinds of learners thrive outside of a classroom. And I think particularly our kids with learning disabilities, to experience this deserved break in the academic rigors that isn't always that accommodating to a differently kind of oriented learner, and really have that young adult feel successful, feel skilled in their own natural abilities, and also start to develop more tools that will really serve them in their next steps of life. So I kind of went a little bit beyond the definition.
Yeah, before you go on, it's important to note what this definition doesn't share. It doesn't share where an individual has to go for their gap time. It doesn't share how long that gap time has to be. It doesn't share what it is that one needs to do. It's more of the modality or the vehicle, and it doesn't actually talk about the journey to get there. And so it's important to note that we have students who choose to spend their gap time in the United States and they never leave. We have students who choose to spend their time internationally and don't really spend a lot of time at home. We have students who take 3 months of gap time, students who take 9 or 12 months of gap time, students who pursue a particular academic interest, students who never want to be involved in academics again and actually only go to the more hands-on. So your gap time or your child's gap time really can be anything that one needs it to be. We're going to talk about how you might go about planning that and thinking a little bit more about that. But it's important to note that while we know that college or a community college or a trade school or the military or going right into a job, those are destinations. The gap year is not a destination on its own. It is really, it's the path that you take to get to that next step. And we want that path to be fruitful and really complementary to whatever education happened before and whatever's coming after.
I think that regardless of the learner that we're talking about, what Jason and I have distilled over the years, lots of things, but what we wanted to share here in this slide, in addition to all students of ours from the last handful of years, as you can see, just in a wide array of environments and small groups and large groups and adventure and kind of career potential experiences in studios with homestay families, with friends. But what we're really talking about, for me, that second 2.0 definition of a gap year, these are, I think, some of both the kind of outcomes, but also the infrastructure that we really believe is ahead of you, particularly when we plan intentionally. So I think it's very realistic to expect that there will be a level of soft and hard skill acquisition. Soft skills, really thinking about communication, just relational skills, I would stretch that to even include a lot of executive functioning and planning.
Sure.
And also hard skills. So the hard skills really speak more to that thing that your young adult might be really passionate about. Music or the wilderness or cultural immersion or volunteering. an internship, working with kids, working with the environment, working with animals. So the hard skill is also a really, you could imagine, as Jason said, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, however long your gap time is, it is still a time of active learning. It's just typically not in a classroom. So it's absolutely reasonable to expect that your young adult could really do a deep dive into an area of interest, and come away with a lot more skill and knowledge. Mentors and peers to Jason and I are just non-negotiable and planning your gap year. Gappers need to be with peers. Young adults need to be with people their age, going through some of the big life questions, the challenges, the successes together. And of course, all of us, I imagine, could hark back between 16 and 25, like our first really important mentor.
Mm.
And so for young adults to be around adults slightly older than them, not as old as we all are, who are inspiring and captivating and intelligent and have a high EQ, and who are really kind of shepherding these students through these life-changing experiences is fundamental for all kinds of students and learners. And again, the hands-on learning piece to us is critical. And definitely for students with learning differences, we know that getting kind of out of our head and being able to have real-world application, real-world relational opportunities, hands-on learning is profound for that, again, skill acquisition, and also I think confidence building. So on a kind of still macro level, these are the things we would really have you set your sights on, and simultaneously that we think are very realistic for you to expect from a well-planned gap time.
Mm. When we're working with students, the first place that we always start with them is not in where they want to go or what they want to do, but it's really why they're taking this time and really trying to understand what their motivations are. There are a lot of parents who say, but if we choose to do this, like there could be so many outcomes that we can't predict. Like maybe it's better to stay on the straight and narrow. And we understand that, and we have a child with learning differences as well, and several different diagnosed disabilities, and we totally appreciate that the predictable is a space that we're all aiming for often. And we have found that gap time really offers students the spaciousness to be able to address the things that are critical for them so that they can go on and be very successful in that next educational step. And so what you'll find listed up here are several of the most commonly cited reasons why students from the US choose to take gap time. And what's wonderful is you may or may not see yourself reflected in these, but you might find that you resonate with multiple of these, which is very common when we're speaking with our students. There are lots of students who are feeling like they put in a big academic effort and they're now burnt out. There's lots of students who are looking to gain maturity and self-confidence. There's tons of students who want to gain independence. So this may resonate with you. We encourage you to really think about this. And if you're a potential gapper who's on this webinar right now, really think for you, what are my grounding motivations for taking this time? Because of course, this sets the foundation. If your desire is to prepare for college, that is going to point you in a particular direction in terms of the types of activities you pursue. If your motivation is that you want to explore yourself in the world, well, that's going to probably point you in a different direction. So it's important to know this heading before we start moving into that research phase.
Right. Because the goals generally become quite synonymous with the benefits too.
So true.
So
Yeah.
when we set our sights and our students really spend some time articulating those intentions, then we know what we're really aiming for and what we are really hoping will be some of the very real outcomes. And I'll say, and sometimes we'll drop polls, and we're not going to do that tonight, but generally when we ask viewers to weigh in, most identify with 50% or more. So none of these are wrong.
Right.
You don't have to choose one. And in fact, I'm sure those of you who are logged in right now are probably relating to at least 3 or 4 if you haven't had time to look through the whole list. And that's great. And it should give you a great sense of reassurance that these are the things that all students and parents are hoping for and also gaining by the end of that time.
Mm. There are a lot of important things to consider when thinking about gap time, and we hear a lot of questions asked very commonly by parents and different questions asked by students. One of the biggest questions everybody asks is, if I take this time, am I going to lose my study habits? Am I going to lose my study skills, my academic acumen? And those are really fair concerns. You know, if you don't do math for a year, you're going to potentially be a little rusty, possibly. And what we want you to know is that when we look at gap year students and we look at the studies that have been done on gap year students, we actually don't find a loss of academic performance for having taken gap time. In fact, colleges that study gap year students have found the exact opposite. Gap year students tend to outperform their peers academically by GPA every single semester of every single year that they're in school. Students who take gap time tend to graduate school in 4 years, as opposed to the national average, meaning over 50% of students who go to a 4-year school graduate in 6 years, right? So being able to leverage your clarity about what you want to study, being more focused, being more mature with the way you approach your time once you go into school, these are all qualities that colleges see in students who have taken gap time. We can tell you right now, it's late fall. We've seen a lot of students who have gone off to college, and we are starting to get calls right now at the end of their first semester. Ooh, this was more overwhelming than I thought. Ooh, I was not prepared for this level of independence. Ooh, I'm not ready for this level of academics. I think I need to backpedal, step away from school, and take some gap time next semester. That's an approach, but that's probably not the most successful feeling approach. That student probably would have been better served taking time right before they went and then going on to school later.
Yeah. I know, I was just thinking, I'm like, I think I've talked to 4 college students
Yeah.
already this week.
Right.
Who are like, you know, I thought about taking a gap year and then I felt really pressured because all my friends were going. I didn't want to lose pace, but now I'm here and I don't think it's the right thing for me to do. And is it too late to gap next semester? And I always say, I just think it's so courageous.
It
It's
is.
really, it's for a long time for these students, it's never too late to pause if the direction you're going in is not serving you, but it takes a lot of guts because there's a lot of momentum and energy and resources. And my guess is for young adults who aren't really thriving, no parent wants to see their kid in a place where they're just treading water. So we're all an eager ear and wanting to help support you if what's happening is not serving you. The second column talks a bit about how do or can gap programs specifically support my LD child. And, you know, there's a level of specificity around your child and the gap year programs that are out there that we just won't be able to cover this evening. So Jason and I kind of wanted to look at it in kind of these bucket areas. I think it's really important to know that a pretty standard student to leader ratio on a gap year program, which could have anywhere from maybe 16 to 32 students, is about 6 to 1. So right there, more than high school, more than college, we are talking about a high level of touch from the instructor level in these organized gap programs, and in contact with the students. So students aren't getting lost through the cracks. And I think that's really important to talk about. And these are just standard, mostly accredited through the GYA or Gap Year Association kinds of program. In different kinds of experiences, you will find different ratios, but these are not even LD specific programs. These are just standard high quality gap year programs. And could your child be successful? Again, not knowing the specifics, I couldn't guarantee it, but 50-50 chance, probably. I'd need to know more, or Elizabeth or Jason would. The other thing to think about with these gap semesters is, in most cases, we are talking about students traveling with a group, with peers, with mentors, and an experience in which housing, meals, and activities are pretty much all planned out and included. So, you know, there's a certain level of navigation on the day-to-day that is not required of the young adult. Their navigation is showing up and engaging the experience. And being open to feedback. If they were 10 minutes late to the group meeting or 3 days in a row, they keep forgetting to show up with their journal and pen. There's going to be people that are looking out for them, holding them to a high standard with a lot of forgiveness and permissiveness. And again, the decision making on a sort of broader level about what a student needs to do on the day or the week or the month is all managed by the program. So a lot of infrastructure and scaffolding already built in. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll pass it back off to Jason, who will take another column here, is almost all of these gap year programs, regardless of what the actual content is, the focus, that there's such a strong emphasis on personal growth throughout these programs. You know, whether these younger adults are doing a farm to table program in sustainability in New England, or Spanish immersion and environmental work in Paraguay, whatever they're doing, there's going to be a really big focus and a high level of understanding on the organization side that these are 17, 18, maybe 19-year-olds who haven't had a lot of experience out of the home. And this is an opportunity to really help them on that journey of becoming a young adult, a responsible, engaging, curious, kind, hopefully respectful young adult. So those are some of the first things that I think out the gate we can offer in the way of reassurance, in terms of how even just a standard or traditional gap year program is really designed to support a wide range of needs of the students.
Oftentimes in the field of experiential education, we talk about what are referred to fondly as the zones of comfort. And most of us live most of our lives in the comfort zone, in the space that we know that we can be successful. There's very little stress because we feel very competent there. But much of the learning that we do actually takes place in the zone outside of that, which is often referred to as the stretch zone or the learning zone. And gap time is all about the learning zone. It's the place where we're likely going to be successful, but it's not always graceful. And we can learn a lot and integrate a lot of information, but it's not a place we can stay forever because it can build in inherent levels of stress. And so if you take something away from tonight, one of the messages we want you to take away is, for your own child, with your own child, for you as the potential gapper, where is that balance between stress and stretch? Right. So if the stretch is that you want to learn skills of independence, then you want to eliminate as much stress from that scenario from the outside, because you want the actual good stress to be the learning of independence. If the stretch is you want Spanish language immersion, then maybe you want to take some of the stress out and have a program that provides you with meals, or maybe it doesn't have a homestay. So you really one wants to think about the balance there for yourself. And that's where these different kinds of program models come into play. Some typical models that you'll be able to apply this philosophy to, one is the idea of a residential model. And this doesn't mean therapeutic. We're not referring to therapeutic programs right now. This means you stay in one place. You live in a house or some kind of a facility, and every day your activities take you away from there or kind of in the surrounding area, but you know where you're coming back to at night. You know where your meals are coming from. You know where your bedroom is. Everything is a bit more predictable. And you can contrast that against something like an expeditionary model, which is something that moves around regularly. Well, that's wonderful because you get a ton of variety, but at the same time, that variety is met with a lot of uncertainty. You don't necessarily know where your next meal is coming from or what it's going to be. You don't necessarily know where you're going to be staying. So again, if these are things that bring up anxiety or stress for you as a potential gapper or your child, it's worth thinking about what model might be a better fit for you. Would you mind picking up from the domestic versus international?
No, not at all. Similarly, these are just great buckets to start with,
right.
And I will say that depending on the student and depending on the disability, there's a lot of variation, but I do find that residential programs, particularly in the fall as the first program, tends to be a really positive start.
Yeah.
A lot of big changes afoot. Let's not throw in another piece where every few days you're packing up your bag, particularly with students dealing with executive functioning and just organizing and the packing, and it's and anxiety. Residential programs tend to be really a fantastic starting point for a lot of students with learning differences. You'll see in subsequent slides, we're going to show a progression, how you might build programs upon one another. And as Jason's talking about with the sort of stretch zone, maybe that expeditionary model is really exciting to the young adult and the young gapper, but maybe a better placement later in the year. And that's a really great strategy that we're going to talk about. So the same could go with domestic and international. Sometimes, and in some cases, a domestic program is a more positive place for a young adult to start if they're managing new medications or telehealth, getting rid of big time zones or challenges around connecting with family supports. A domestic program, a domestic residential program could do a lot to support a young adult. And then if the aspirations again are to be international, we could work our way towards that. And similarly, just you best is one of our favorite kind of hashtags. So is the goal to really be focused on the soft skills right out the gate? Or does your student, young adult have like really, really, strong kind of interpersonal skills and independent living skills? And really what they want is to start diving into a harder skill, an area that maybe they had to do less of because they had more academic support during high school due to their IEP or 504. And now they get to really dive into the ceramics or a language or things, electives that had to get peeled away because they weren't as much of a priority. Yeah.
Oftentimes we'll hear from families where a student has a diagnosis for ADD or ADHD or executive functioning challenges. Our gap year program is specifically designed to help my child with building these skill sets. And while there are a couple of programs that do have that level of specificity, they are geared towards students who have learning disabilities. More often than not, what you will find is that the inherent nature of a more structured gap year experience is actually helping to build those skills because there's a measure of accountability of being part of a group. Students are giving high levels of responsibility after they've been able to demonstrate competency within aspects of leadership, whether that's planning the itinerary for the day, being the group leader in one aspect for the day, having a specific level of responsibility that is they're taking care of in the group. So this actually really supports students in being able to do the things that might be hard for us as families to do. We're constantly, having to wake our child up and get them up in the morning. And, like, how will they ever be able to do that? Well, they'll do it because the second time that they're late to a group meeting and they realize the entire group has been waiting for them, there is actually inherent level of pressure and the leader is going to want to really work with them. What are some strategies you can employ? Because the next time we're actually all going to be really quite frustrated with this situation.
And here's the big difference with college, right? No teacher is coming
That's
to
right.
your student's dorm room to knock on the door and say, hey, you've been missing class.
Right.
Here, the students are held to a high level of accountability and it's right there and they'll be bought in. And again, I think it's the gap year can bring up so much fear for any family. And particularly when we know we've had to support and advocate for our kids more, maybe at this stage. But I can tell you once you get to college, there's not going to be a whole lot of handholding and there actually will be a lot more support on a gap year program than you could possibly imagine. So it's really, it's exciting and a joyous place where students really feel like they are seen and have the opportunity to thrive.
We mentioned before this idea of establishing your whys, and we got to see quite a few different whys that both many students comment on, but also these outcomes are really beneficial for students with learning differences and disabilities. But once we get beyond the why, now we can start getting into some of those fun explorations. And we really do encourage students to take pen and paper. We don't want this done digitally, to go and make a list, kind of a dream list of things that they're interested in exploring, places they want to go, skills they want to learn, the kinds of people they want to be around. And we encourage you as families to allow this to be a very liberated experience. There will come budgetary restrictions and restrictions of what you're comfortable with as, being parents or guardians. All of those things will come later, but this initial brainstorm is really something we want the students to do on their own. And what we have found over and over is that students who do this brainstorm, they add to it, they treat it as a living organic document, they star the things that are most profound for them over time, that they keep coming back to. Those are the students who really hone in very quickly on what it is that they're going to do in terms of the structure of their gap time. And so oftentimes we see that parents and guardians really agree with the priorities that do float to the top. And once you figure that out, finding those ideas is actually not as complicated as you might think.
I often hear from parents of students with an ADD or ADHD diagnosis, like, he's a great student. She's really smart. But if they're not interested in the topic, forget about it.
Sure.
And I often say, I mean, that sounds like pretty much every human being on the planet. If we don't care, we don't care, and we don't work as hard. And so it is also really important. This is kind of that square peg in a round hole moment. You could find a program that has all the dream scaffolding that you want, but if you or your young gapper is not bought into the content, we can't force that. We really want the student to drive what happens so that they have that passion and that buy-in. And then we make sure that the program is designed and has the infrastructure to support them to be successful. And that's where we've made it to the bottom right corner of the slide. Transparency with programs.
Yeah.
Cannot express enough how important this is. And I will say, I think one of the things that really impresses me with this generation is a real lack of embarrassment or shame around a diagnosis. So we ask students very candidly, both on phone and in paperwork, and programs will as well. Any diagnoses, mental health, physical health, prescription medications, therapy, not to be invasive and not to be punitive, but to make sure we are equipped to support you, to make sure you realize that some ADHD meds are actually really hard to bring into China.
Right.
And so a 3-month supply is going to be very problematic. So it's all going to come back to your students' well-being. But beginning with incredibly transparent conversations with each other as a family, with gap year consultants, with college advisors, with programs themselves will be critical. In the same way, you'd say, our child has a really severe nut allergy, right? That's a
Yeah, you
health
wouldn't
thing.
leave that out.
You would never
Right.
leave it out. And so similarly, we really want to make sure that you feel incredibly confident, and so that together you and programs can decide. Applying to gap year programs is not at all like college.
Mm.
It will require some skin in the game. They are largely self-selective, meaning that if you have spent the time to investigate the program and submit an application, 9 times out of 10, that's probably not even the right number, you are the person they want with them. So programs will fill first come, first serve. And then there'll be kind of extra levels of discernment through the application process, maybe a brief phone or Zoom interview. And in most cases, students are accepted into their top choice program,
Mhm.
because you'll know when you're looking at it if you really love it, if you feel like you're up for the challenges. And so if you are checking yes in your own mental boxes, then chances are you've got yourself lined up really well. But again, transparency, making sure these programs are equipped to support your unique profile and disabilities, mental and physical health are just critically important to the success.
And if for some reason a program said that they can't support you, they've done you a favor, right?
Mhm.
They've done you a favor because they've been really honest with you, and they're likely going to be able to point you in the direction of an organization that might be able to support you better. And this would not be the first scenario that they've encountered, right? And so that's something that I really love about our field, is there's a level of collegiality and honesty on all sides. We want to role model exactly what we're hoping students will do for themselves.
That's exactly right. We've given you a lot, and now we want to kind of round the bend. This is the last slide of like a 3-part series. We're going to talk about this idea of a gap year progression, and we're going to illustrate it with 2 alumni students of ours. So you've come up with some ideas from that amazing brainstorm. We've thought about some of the logistics and nuts and bolts of what needs to happen. You've rested on the idea that you really love the idea of a residential program in the US, that you love the idea of a language and volunteer experience maybe later in the year. There's a lot to take into consideration. There are very few full year-length gap year programs at this point. We've had a few in the last decade or 2, but it's really not what students want. Students want variety. I get it. I think that's appropriate. And you might find your year breaking itself into parts. Now, remember from our first definition, it didn't say how long you were gapping or how long your parts need to be. So take this slide with a grain of salt. Jason and I do a lot of educating and speaking around the gap year, and this slide we have found time and time again has a real impact on the audience. So It's just a model though. We're breaking it down to sort of three parts. Like think about fall, winter, spring. You know, the progression suggestive of most structured to semi-structured to least structured as a possibility. More in your comfort zone, a little bit more in the stretch zone, even a little further out of the stretch, you know, into the stretch zone. So we're talking about building a progression so that your year starts in the shallow end, starts with the kind of flotation devices, gives you the buoying and support you need. And with each subsequent experience, you might be able to strip some of that away. There's some subtleties in the words here, beyond the obvious popping out around sort of most, semi, and least. And again, you could break this up into kind of a fall, a winter, and a spring as an example. But notice initially under most structured, we've got housing, meals, group, and mentors. There's that kind of, you know, and is it life skills? Is it travel? What's the theme? That's again got to really come to the gap or what's driving them. But as Jason carries us forth, we can like look how those words shift and change and what makes that less structured as time goes on.
Yeah, if you felt like going on to a slightly different program model in your winter or spring was right for you, taking a step into a more semi-structured experience could be wonderful. And then the difference is being we go from maybe it was a something that was a student oriented, like building life skills, right? That's all about the student, to something that's actually the student contributing to something like volunteering. Perhaps instead of traveling and getting a lot of broad exposure, we're doing a deeper dive and it's more of a language immersion. Perhaps instead of it being like a thematic, you know, we're working on a program that's environmentally and conservation focused. Now we're actually taking on something that's got a bit more independence built in, like a skills-based course. Wow, so we've taken that next step away. We've maybe gone from where there were leaders and instructors to maybe now we'd have more folks who are closer to supervisors and mentors. And now we can take that next step as the year goes on, like Jane said, into that least structured, where ultimately you are likely doing a lot on your own and supporting yourself quite a bit. Maybe it's an internship, maybe it's a job, maybe it's a work exchange, things that have much less scaffolding than the other two that we'd already inhabited and experienced during the year.
And we couldn't possibly know if this is the flow that's right for you. It's a strategy that we impart to all of our families because there's something really here to examine. You may already know we're going to be most structured fall and spring semester.
Sure.
That's what our family is. That's what our young adult needs, and that's great. Maybe though the most structured in the fall again is domestic, starts in the US, or maybe it's residential, and maybe you still pursue a very structured program in the winter or spring, but maybe it's international, maybe it's expeditionary. So there are other ways to build in levels of growth and exposure that are going to fit within your kind of bottom line.
We've been
Yeah.
talking a lot about this idea of programs, but gap time can be created out of lots of other experiences too. So a semi-structured experience might be moving home and taking a job in the community or having your own apartment, right? So you've got a bit more support, you've got things that feel familiar, but the stretch is you're doing a bit more on your own, right? So there are a lot of ways to build in this kind of a progression without having to enroll in back-to-back programs or back-to-back-to-back experiences. We've seen students do this on, you know, very tight budgets and still have very rewarding time. We will say that the more support you build in, the more likely you are to see accelerated growth when students go off and do kind of independent travel on their own for the entirety of their gap time. They do something that's very unstructured, like work exchange. You have to really dig deeply to find the growth and the meaning in those things. You have to really be self-reflective. And so we've found that students who do start in a more facilitated experience tend to have the skills to be more self-reflective later.
Yeah. So hopefully this is all starting to come together and make sense. So what better way than to illustrate it? Actually, I think we're just going to do one and
Yeah,
we'll
I
see
think
how
that's a nice
questions
idea.
are going.
Yeah.
So Emma was a really inspiring student. Emma actually gapped during COVID. So this is 2020, 2021. So, you know, a lot of things were confusing and uncertain for all of us. And Emma really wanted to be home in the fall, which can work, but it was really important to stay focused on something, right? It's important to have a plan. Siblings are back at school, friends and are off at school, parents are back at jobs, you know, summer summers of fun and camp counseling and visiting grandparents in Maine and, are done. So having a plan is so important. And Emma had a curiosity and interest in maybe getting her EMT, seeing what it could be to work on an ambulance. So when you're not doing school and can enroll over the course of a semester in a community college course and study to be an EMT, that's something that's really attainable. She had the safety and security of home, and yet could, at her own pace, and obviously the course was dictating it, but with no other school requirements, could really take on a significant volume of information, very hands-on. She found it incredibly rewarding and did pass all of her exams. And before even she left for the winter, she was offered a job. She applied to work on an ambulance and got a job. And if we jump ahead, you'll see that she ended up working on an ambulance in the spring. But a la the model that we just shared with you, she did have a real desire to be with peers. That fall at home did get lonely, really wanted to get out there. Travel was starting to open up a little bit more. And the idea of being with a bunch of like-minded peers, somewhere beautiful, somewhere warm, getting off the East Coast, with a focus on environment and service really appealed to her. And she joined a group program in Hawaii, a 2-month program. Came home, worked on that ambulance, and was off to college in the fall. And just to read in Emma's words, I took a gap year to explore life outside of school and to get real world experience. This year has been the most fulfilling of my life. As you can imagine, we hear statements like that all the time.
We really do.
And even with students that we worked with 20 and 30 years ago, who we are still in touch with, we'll still point to that gap year is really one of the best decisions they ever made. And what a grounding force and a pinpoint on their compass it gave them for the rest of their lives. So we'll end with that for now, and I'll just pull up a resource slide just in case some are new to Elizabeth or to J2 Guides, just to be able to quickly access our websites. I want to put that up there. We can't see if there are questions coming in, so Elizabeth, if you have comments or questions of your own or that you're seeing that you can share, we're all ears.
Well, as always, bravo, awesome. You guys rock. I so appreciate you doing this for people and demystifying this all. One of the things I just, on my own question, you mentioned earlier, accreditation. Do you think it's important for families to make sure that the program they go through is accredited by the GYA, the Gap Year Association?
That's such a great question. So I've spent 12 years on the Standards and Accreditation Committee, which essentially designed and maintains all of the standards for programs. And I have reviewed 10 different program applications and supported a number of other reviews. The organizations that have become accredited through the Gap Year Association have passed really high bars. And the same thing is true for the consultants. There's only, I think, 6 accredited consultants in the country. Jamie and I are 2 of them. The bar is really high. So if you see a program that has achieved accreditation, you know that specifically philosophically, they have met a really high standard. From the level of transparency, they've met a high standard. From a level of risk management, they've met a high standard. From the way that they operate with third-party providers, people who support their programs, they've met a really high standard. And there are other standards depending upon where the program goes and what they do. So the answer is, if you see an accredited program and it seems like a good fit, you can feel a lot of confidence that they are operating kind of in the top echelon. But just because an organization doesn't have accreditation does not mean that they're not excellent as well. And this is where it does get tricky. There are over 100 member organizations in just the membership section of the Gap Year Association. 75 of them are not accredited yet. And so there are many, many high quality organizations. Just even to become a member of GYA, you have to fulfill quite a few requirements. So even that bar is something that not everybody can hurdle over right away. And so including that you have to have been in operation for 2 years, right? So there's really high levels of expectation in terms of what Gap Year Association is offering. And there are many organizations that are out there in the world, probably in the realm of thousands of opportunities, that will never seek to become a member or seek accreditation because they're a small opportunity or they're a work exchange. And so making sure you're asking good questions. This is the value of working with somebody who is a professional one way or another to help sort you through what your priorities and needs are versus what an experience can offer. But doing your due diligence. And we know this is a realm that basically nobody's done research in, right? It's not like buying a car, you're going to do it 5 times in your lifetime. This is this is a one-off likely for you and your family. And so the good news is there's a lot of great information out there that you can utilize.
Well, I imagine, we're doing this on Facebook. There's probably a Facebook group for that, right?
Oh, I'm sure. And there's
I'm on some of those Facebook groups that are focused on gap year parents, and I have to be really careful because and also just the people start spreading their own information, and again, what's right for someone else's kid is not necessarily for yours.
Yeah.
So just because, and I do think starting with the accredited programs is an obvious starting point.
Yeah.
But then again, don't be dismayed if what you are looking for isn't there. But it does just help give you a sense of the quality and standard that you should be looking for. But that certainly exists in other programs that don't have that badge.
Right.
But just talking to friends and talking on chats in groups is dangerous. I'm just watching information that people are sharing, and I don't have enough time in my day to weigh in and say, redirect people. So I do get a little worried about that. But that also takes us back to, when getting on the phone with programs, of course, is talking to references. And I think coming to programs, with a range of questions, being prepared to be transparent and ask about some of the really specific things. I'll just say there as an example, Jason and I come from a background in direct programming, and I saw it all, and was that director receiving cold calls from families, seeing if our program was appropriate. And I'd get calls like, what's the worst thing that's ever happened on program? And, I could talk through that stuff. And so the reality is that really a helpful question for you? It may or may not be.
Right.
But I think what's more useful is, so we're coming to you with, an interesting young adult. Our child uses they, them pronouns, is diagnosed with anxiety and executive functioning and dyslexia. It, hasn't really ever recovered from COVID, but is a passionate artist and desperately wants to kind of find their voice again, and start telling your story, because do you think you're in a position to support our family? Will my child be safe and feel included there? Those are the questions that you should be getting off a kind of web chat, a live chat, getting on the phone with the appropriate person, seeing how they address it, and then of course speaking to references. So that would be something to apply, whether of course it's an accredited program or not.
And for better or for worse, families of children with learning disabilities are pretty well practiced at, at asking questions and advocating.
So good.
So your superpower, hard earned, is actually going to really support you in this way, because you're already thinking about your child and what is really going to be the set of needs that's going to help them thrive and succeed. And so, don't be afraid to be transparent up front and ask the questions that you need the answers to.
Yeah, and I'm laughing and smiling when talking about Facebook groups. I should have said that with a little bit of caution. I run a Facebook group for parents on college transition and accommodations, and I actually keep it very tightly locked because I have found that there's a lot of misinformation about accommodations at the college level, what colleges have to do, people encouraging each other to do certain things. And so, yes, I feel that pain. We have an audience, we have 2 audience questions, at least for now. So the first one that came in from Monique is, are there programs that are especially good for kids who need support with executive functioning?
I mean, I would say quite a few, but I think a starting point that could be really powerful for families to look at. There's actually 2 in the US that I'm thinking of. Broad Futures.
Sure. Yep.
As well as Dynamy.
Yep.
And I don't know, you know,
I would also include SOAR in that as well.
yeah, yeah. So Dynamy and Broad Futures, you know, residential programs, really designed to help students develop that independent living set of skills, cooking and budgeting and getting dressed and showing up, and dovetailing that with internships and real world experience. So also getting a lot of coaching and support on transferable skills into the workplace, communicating, projects, deadlines, management, and all of that. And I think both programs different, but do a really wonderful job for the right student. So those are the first two that come to mind for me. And then Jason, do you want to say any more about SOAR?
Well, SOAR is essentially a 9-month-long wilderness-based leadership experience that is focused for students with ADD, ADHD, and who are working on executive functioning skills. So, that might be the right fit for a particular student if you like the outdoors and are interested in spending a lot of time in the outdoors, whereas Broad Futures and Dynamy are both internship and urban-based programs, which, that might resonate for other people.
Yeah.
Well, and as you talked about, students can develop certain executive function skills just by virtue of being in a group and having to get themselves organized and, pack.
Any program, that offers the chance for students to learn to cook, where students are doing a lot of chores or work on the experience, those are all going to really build those skills. And so when I think about the students who come to us with executive functioning challenges or ADD, ADHD, I'm often thinking about experiences that they're not traveling tours as much as they are an opportunity for students to dig their hands in and have a lot of responsibility, with great oversight, of course, but have a lot of responsibility. So they're really practicing those skills all the time.
That sounds really good. So just so folks who are just joining us know, I have dropped in the chat here and I'll do this in the comments on in the description on YouTube. Jane and Jason's website. You can also schedule a free consult with them. I've got the link in there. So there's lots of opportunities to continue this conversation. This is a great question. My friend Kelly, the transition specialist, is on here. She says, when considering a gap year for a student with learning disabilities, what criteria or signs should we look for to determine if their mental health is well managed enough to ensure a successful and productive experience? It's a great question.
It's a really good question.
Well, I mean, speaking with their mental health professional would be a really great place to start. I think a lot of youth specializing mental health professionals are really cued into the idea of both summer-based programming as well as the possibility of what gap time can offer. And I mean, one of the first things that we often hear is that students should remain on whatever medications that they're on that are helping to manage that, because these experiences do have inherent levels of stress built in. So when we used to run a program that had offerings in the summer, we would often have students come and they just wouldn't be taking their meds in the summer because they weren't in school. That's a really challenging equation to try and balance when you're going into an environment that's completely different and unpredictable. And so that's one space that I think is interesting. Did you have other things you were going to add?
I think for me, it's always connecting with the student. So, and maybe that seems obvious, but a lot of my first calls are with a parent, and maybe then the second call is with a parent, and the parent is great and articulate, and they're talking about their kid, and the kid sounds amazing. And I realize I haven't actually looked at this student yet. We haven't made contact, and that's pretty important. So a level of student buy-in is really important for me to see or hear.
Yeah.
And not just hear a parent tell me that their kid is bought in, but for students to be like, oh my gosh, gap year, so cool. I'm terrified, but sounds amazing. That's enough. That's all I need to hear to continue the conversation. But the student needs to get in the driver's seat pretty soon in the process. If just a parent is driving it, that is a red flag. So that's one kind of level of discernment. And then I do ask at point blank their level, to gauge their comfort in talking to me about, as I said, we have both in phone and in writing, we ask students about, and we even have a sample health form, something that they would have to fill out for a gap year program that we make them fill out. It includes everything from, do you see a therapist? Do you take medication? Have you ever been arrested, expelled, you know, suspended? Do you have any, you know, any allergies, you know, really kind of, and puts it all on one sheet to kind of you know, not make any of it one more important than the other. Just it's in the context of well-being. And then seeing if a student is willing to elaborate and discuss that more. So for me, their comfort and ability to be transparent and engage with me in that level is also incredibly telling. So with those two things underway, I am generally incredibly confident then furthering the conversation about helping to get into the why of the gap year and the brainstorm.
So
I want
go ahead, Jason.
I just want to add that, as Jane was suggesting before, some of these more residential programs, whether abroad or international, offer students a bit more spaciousness. So you could maintain a relationship with your therapist while you're gone in many of those cases, whereas the expeditionary programs you might not be able to. It's important to remember that a typical gap year program, like the ones that you'd find on Gap Year Association's website, none of their staff are trained social workers, psychologists. That's not a requirement.
professionals,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
not a requirement. So you're not going to be receiving any direct therapy or psychological services on those programs. In fact, that probably qualifies for a completely different category of therapeutic programming, which is wonderful and robust. And there are many amazing options out there for students who are, you know, struggling with substance abuse challenges, or students who are just, you know, moving through their own mental health spaces. And those are different programs even amongst themselves. We have seen since the pandemic the rise of what might best be described as like wellness programs. And these are programs that bridge the typical gap year space and the therapeutic space, meaning that they don't offer direct therapy on the program, but they have a lot of wellness practices built in. The pacing is very slow. There might be life skills and wellness classes offered on top of all of the other amazing experiences. I have a student in a program like that right now, loving it, having an amazing experience in New Zealand. And there's several organizations that have been doing great work in the past already in a different realm, but have now transitioned into gap year space. I don't know if question.
Good question to follow up on meds. So somebody says, are there similar restrictions on transgender individuals who take cross-sex hormones? Obviously concerned for the safety of my young adult. At the same time, we want them to have great adventures.
The question was restrictions?
Like
I guess.
Oh, because I had mentioned the meds
Right.
that's a
Right.
great question. That would take some digging into on all of our part. I haven't, I mean, we've worked with some trans students, but the medication piece is not something I'm aware of, and that's a country by country.
I would think, yeah.
I think in terms of a student's sense of safety and wellness, I think you could feel pretty confident that the level of inclusivity, you know, most programs have student contracts that may say things like, you can't drink on program, or you can't do drugs on program, and bullying is not acceptable on program. So, you know, with what we are seeing in these rising young adults, and the level and numbers of students that identify in a multitude of ways that transcend what many of us grew up with, has increased to a level where the programs have really risen to that challenge. And that would be, again, a great conversation. Once you find a program that your young adult's really excited about, that's going to be a really important conversation to have with that team, both the welcomeness and inclusivity among the group and your concerns around that. You might ask about cultural implications. If it's an overseas experience you're looking for, that's something to be savvy to. And then also if they're aware of, for lack of a better word, any kind of contraindications between the meds your child is on and trying to get them into a country, because that's a new one for me. So, but
Right,
now,
yeah. But it's a
Yeah.
good one.
Yeah, it's
All
really
right, we'll take one last question, then we'll wrap up. Is there a gap year questioner, I guess like a questionnaire, maybe it means questionnaire, that can be used to guide the entry into a gap year journey?
We have worksheets to kind of generate ideas, if that's the kind of thing you're talking about, like how do I get my kid to start the brainstorming and the what is your why? We certainly have worksheets that we send out to families. And if that person who asked the question just wanted to email info@j2guides.com, I'd be happy to send it. Or maybe there's, I don't know, can we post it with the recording?
It'd have to get posted
I'd
in
have to
the
make it
chat
up.
and
Yeah,
then,
yeah,
oh,
So
actually, I
I-
don't even know that you could post the document.
that's what I'm
Yeah.
realizing.
Yep,
So
it'd have
Yeah,
to-
But
so
there are things like that. And I think even the GYA website, the Gap Year Association website, also has a gap year planning guide.
That's right.
It's broad, but I think a really helpful start.
well, I'm gonna drop your contact form in the comments here so that parent can just come reach out to you directly. And I lied. I'm gonna take this one more question because it's a really good one. Sorry. Are there any financial aid programs that supply that? And this is a really interesting question since we're talking about students with disabilities. Sponsorship through the Department of Rehab. So I suspect that, like DVR funds probably can't be used for that, unless it was like specific. I mean, I guess it could technically be a gap year, which just means in between high school and going to college, but perhaps there would be limits on what that could be. But now I'll stop talking and see what you say.
I've never had a student try to use the DVR funds like you are suggesting. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting question. Almost every established gap year program has a scholarship / financial aid application and generally try to be quite generous. But when we say quite generous, we might see a student, be able to remove 25 to 30% of a program fee. It's rare to see 50% of a program fee taken off. And these experiences can be quite expensive, right? We might be talking about something that's $15,000 or $17,000 a semester. The other thing is that if an organization is accredited through the Gap Year Association, or if it has its own independent relationship with a higher education institution and they offer a college credit on the experience, which doesn't mean a lot more academic work while you're on the experience, just to let you know, it's not going to detract from the experience. Then you can generally use 529 funds if you've saved for those. And so that is a way that a lot of families do finance gap time, is because they're able to leverage that to pay for the program fee and the credit. And so that has been actually a huge initiative of the Gap Year Association in the last 5 years, is to help broker that relationship. We have a wonderful new relationship with University of Montana. We have courses now where you can gain credit for volunteering, for doing internships, for leadership and leadership training. I mean, it's really robust as well as topic driven. And so there's some really wonderful opportunities for students who want to use 529.
This is an area we're all very excited about, because it is just another level of legitimizing the benefits of a well-planned gap year, and the fact that a family could draw from their 529 to pay for gap year experience is really quite extraordinary. Could you use like an example of a class someone could take? Because I think it's important that families like, well, but we're talking about a student who maybe doesn't really want that much more academics.
Right.
Jason's so deep in it right now with his work with GYA. If you could just share like an example of what someone would do and how little it really actually will impact their experience, because it's important, I think.
Yeah, one of the, I think, beautiful things that if the program is not academic in nature in and of itself, usually what would happen is a student would have one book that is required reading, and generally students choose to read that in advance of going anyway. Students would often keep a journal or a blog. I know blogs still exist, who knew? And keep a blog or a journal, and that journal is actually a set of prompts that are meant to be reflective prompts, and that would be submitted at the end. And then generally after the course is over, there would be a 5-page paper. So if we're talking about an ethical volunteering course, you've read a book about ethical volunteering, which is going to be one of the most current books about that topic, that's actually a particularly interesting topic right now. You would have this journal or blog that you're maintaining while on the program, which again is all going to be accessible, and the organization is going to be able to support that. And then at the end, you're writing this paper that is graded by an instructor of record. They are there to support you. They're communicating with your student. There's opportunities for revision, and then that goes in and is submitted, and generally the transcript is then issued by Association's case, University of Montana.
And what's amazing is even if a student just does that one course,
exactly.
Let's say the program tuition is $15,000. It's not.
That 3-credit course could take.
You could pay for the entire $15,000 now from your 529.
Yeah.
or a portion of it if you didn't want to take so much out. So it's really, really cool. And most kids are going to be journaling anyway. And a passionate student might want to read about Buddhism or ethical volunteering. Like there's a lot of opportunities there. So it's a really exciting possibility in terms of diversifying our resources and trying to help our young adults have these incredible experiences we hadn't planned for 18 years ago. So.
Well, amazing. So for folks who are watching live, as I said, go into the chat. You'll find their contact information and the other links. You can schedule a free consult. For those of you watching this on YouTube, you'll also find this in the description. Jane and Jason, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to visit with you every fall. Aren't they generous and kind folks? Don't you want to work with them? I do. I mean, I'm ready for a gap year now.
That's how we feel about you. We're coming for you in 2 years.
I love it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Have a good time.
Thank you for
Okay.
having us.
Thanks.